Beneath the grey skies of Rusan, the wind didn't howl. It whispered. It drifted through broken trees and scorched stone like a memory looking for a place to rest. The land had seen too much. The clash of the Brotherhood of Darkness and the Army of Light had scarred every inch of it. But deep among the ruins and ash, something still lived. A child, small, quiet, alone. Her name was Rain. She was too young to understand the war that had brought her here, too small to carry the weight of names like Jedi or Sith. When she was taken from her home, the Jedi called it a noble cause. They told her she had been chosen, but Rain had not felt chosen. She had felt pulled, as if the Force itself had reached out and tugged her from a place she barely remembered anymore. The ship, the robes, the names, none of it had ever felt real. Not the way the sound of her cousin's laughter had, not the warmth of home. Now there was only this place, Rusan. She had become separated from her Jedi group during the battle. There had been shouting, fire, flashes of light so bright they blinded her. And then silence. Just trees, rocks, and the smell of burned soil. Rain wandered for hours, maybe days. Time didn't move the same in fear. Hunger came next, then cold. But the strange thing was, she didn't cry. Not even once. Something inside her wouldn't let her. The Force was there, not loud, not bold, but quiet, like the wind. It moved around her, through her, as if the planet itself had begun to notice her presence. At night, when she curled into the hollows of fallen logs, the air would change. Animals that should have attacked stayed away. The cold would ease just enough to let her sleep. Even her breath, shallow and uncertain, seemed to slow and match the rhythm of something ancient beneath the ground. Was it protection or something else? Rain didn't know how to control the Force, but it knew her. When she grew frightened, the branches would sway, rocks would shift, just slightly. Creatures would turn their heads before she even moved. She thought at first it was coincidence. But one night, when a scavenger crept too close, hungry and desperate, it stopped, frozen, just steps away, as if held by an invisible hand. Its eyes stared through her. Then it turned and fled. Rain had not raised a hand. She had not spoken, but she had wished it gone, and it had gone. Maybe that's when she began to understand that she was different, not just from other children, but from everyone. She began to whisper to herself, not in fear, but in rhythm, words she didn't understand. They came to her in dreams, in visions. Sometimes she saw faces, a man with yellow eyes, a temple with no roof, a war that stretched beyond the stars. Had she seen these things before, or were they memories from someone else? Each day, Rain wandered deeper into the wild. The signs of battle became fewer, but the silence grew thicker. She didn't feel alone, not truly. Something was always there, not following her but waiting, watching, as if her steps had been expected. She began to question what the Jedi had told her, that they were peacekeepers, that the Sith were monsters. But who had left her behind, or had abandoned her when the fire fell and the sky split open? Not the Sith, not the shadows. And when she thought about the Jedi, there was no warmth, only confusion, only silence. She found a stream one morning, its waters still and cold. She bent to drink, and for the first time in days saw her reflection. Mud streaked across her face. Her eyes looked older than they should have. Her lips didn't smile. But behind her, in the water's surface, something moved. A shape, a shadow. She turned quickly. Nothing there. Only the wind again. Only the weight of something she couldn't name. But she didn't run. Not this time. Because whatever it was It didn't scare her. Not anymore. She started to talk to the silence, not in full thoughts, not in stories, just small things. Her name, the names of those she missed, the things she remembered about home, a tree near the edge of her village, the sound of her cousin's feet running across the wooden floor. She spoke because it made her feel real again, and when she did, the air would shift slightly, like something was listening, not answering, but present, as if the planet itself had begun to hold her words. Sometimes she would wake from sleep with a name in her mouth, not her own, Darth Bane. She didn't know who that was. She didn't even know what Darth meant, but she felt that name like a drumbeat far away. When she whispered it, the trees seemed to still. Even the wind paused. There was weight in it, a kind of memory that didn't belong to her, but had found her anyway. She began to walk toward that feeling, not because she knew where it was, but because it was pulling her. Every footstep felt chosen by something she didn't understand. Her path curved away from what remained of the war. The broken ships, the melted armor, all left behind. Instead, she followed the roots, the canyons, the quiet, and the Force followed her. It was strange how it never spoke, not in words, but in feelings, in warnings, in warmth. When she stepped too close to danger, her skin would crawl. When she was meant to turn, a bird would cry out. It wasn't guidance, it was suggestion, gentle, patient, like a hand waiting beside hers, but never forcing it to move. She began to notice the ruins, old stone half buried in the ground, pillars cracked and covered in moss. Some looked like they had been temples once, but not Jedi temples. These felt different. The stones were darker, the carvings were sharper, deeper, angrier. She couldn't read the language etched into them, but something inside her understood it, not the meaning, the feeling. And the feeling was power. In one ruin she found a hallway almost completely buried. She crawled inside, ignoring the dirt and the weight pressing above her. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Not in temperature, but in emotion. The walls didn't want her there, and yet they allowed her. At the center of the chamber was a broken pedestal. Upon it, dust, just dust. But as she reached toward it, her fingertips tingled. A vision filled her mind. Not like the dreams before, but sharp and immediate. A man kneeling, not in worship but in pain. A figure behind him, tall and wrapped in shadow. Voices without sound. And a sense of something ancient, something that had waited for her. Not because she was Rain, but because she had no one else. She pulled her hand back. The vision vanished. The pedestal remained empty. But she wasn't the same. Could it be that the Force had brought her here not to save her, but to offer her something? She didn't feel safe, but she didn't feel afraid either. What she felt was choice. Quiet and slow, like a door opening at the farthest edge of her thoughts. That night, as she lay beneath a half-broken archway and watched the stars, she wondered if anyone was still looking for her. Had the Jedi returned? Had they even noticed she was missing? Or had they already written her off, another casualty in a war too large to feel every loss? And then she thought of the Sith. Not the stories the Jedi told, not the monsters from books, but the ones who once stood in these very places, who had carved these stones, who had whispered to the Force not in obedience, but in challenge. Maybe they had been monsters, or maybe they had been like her, lost, forgotten, waiting to be found. The days passed without names. She no longer knew what time was. The sun above Ruusan felt tired, like it only rose out of habit. The forest around her grew quiet, not because it was empty but because it was listening, always listening. And Rain, once afraid to even breathe too loudly, now walked with a strange kind of peace, not joy, not hope, but something still, something steady. She didn't search for food the same way anymore. Somehow she knew where to go, which roots would hold water, which creatures would not strike. She didn't think of this as power, just instinct. But there were moments when she felt more than instinct, moments when her footsteps would echo louder than they should, when shadows would stretch longer, when the silence around her would bend as if waiting for her to speak something true. And sometimes she did. She whispered to the Force, not to ask but to tell, about her dreams, her memories, her confusion. She didn't expect answers, and none came, but she felt heard, as if each word she spoke sank into the ground and stayed there, becoming part of the world around her. Then came the footprints, not hers, not animal. Fresh. Rain crouched low, her breath stilling on its own. The prints were large, adult, deliberate, leading away from the ruins toward a deeper part of the valley. She didn't know why she followed, only that something inside her said it mattered. The path led her to a clearing, and there, standing in silence, was a man, tall, dark armor, face hidden beneath a hood and mask. He did not move, did not speak. But when Rain stepped into the clearing, she felt the air change like it had before, near the pedestal. Like something ancient had taken notice. She didn't run. The man lowered his hood. Yellow eyes watched her, but there was no rage, no fear, just recognition. He said her name. Not shouted, not asked. He said it like it was a memory. Rain. And in that moment something inside her folded inward, not in fear, but in understanding. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he had been waiting. Maybe not for her exactly, but for someone. And now that she was here, he no longer had to wait. He told her the war was over, that the Jedi had won, that the Sith had been destroyed. But not all of them. He was Darth Bane. And Rain, she was meant to become more. She didn't reply, not with words, because something in her already had. When he offered his hand, she didn't take it out of trust. She took it because the silence between them said more than any promise. Was this fate? Was it the will of the Force? Or was it the result of being left behind and finding power in the emptiness? Rain walked beside him, deeper into the valley. Not a prisoner, not a student, not yet. But something had begun. Not loudly, not with fire, but with a whisper beneath gray skies on a world that had forgotten peace. And that whisper would grow. The first time he saw her, she was not standing tall or strong. She was sitting on the edge of a fallen tree, her feet barely touching the ground, her hands pressed into the dirt like she needed to feel that she still existed. Her eyes didn't flinch when he approached. They studied him, steady, cold, curious, no fear, only quiet. Darth Bane did not speak right away. He watched her, the way one might study a weapon still buried in soil, waiting to see if it might reveal its shape. Around them the Force moved, not in waves but in threads, thin, delicate, but constant. It clung to the girl, whispered through her breath. She didn't reach for it, didn't try to call it, yet it answered her all the same. She asked him if he had come to kill her. The question wasn't, afraid. It was tired. He told her no. He said her name. Rain. And in that moment, her body stiffened, not because she was surprised, but because something deeper than memory responded. That name had meaning. But he did not mean it as kindness. He meant it as proof that he already knew who she was, that the Force had already told him. He sat across from her in silence, not close, not warm, but there, present, like a weight she could not move around. He asked her what she remembered. She answered with things that didn't matter: trees, noises, faces with no names. He didn't press her. Because Bane wasn't set searching for memories. He was searching for instinct. When she spoke, he listened to the pauses between her words, the way her gaze drifted, not away from him, but beyond him, towards something he couldn't see. He knew that feeling, the distant stare of someone who had heard the Force too clearly, too young. He asked her what she wanted. She said she did instead know. He told her that was the right answer. Wanting was dangerous. It meant weakness. It meant attachment. And yet he had wanted, and that had made him strong, because he had wanted power and nothing else. But this girl, she did not want. She waited. Could it be that she was not empty but patient? He tested her, gave her orders, told her to follow, not to see if she would obey, but to see if she would question. She didn't. Not out of submission, but something stranger, as if his presence didn't frighten her, but made sense. She walked behind him as he moved through the forests of Ruusan, retracing steps. Only he remembered. The scars of battle still lingered. Fallen bodies, broken armor, craters left by powers no longer present. She didn't ask about any of it. Her silence wasn't ignorance, it was understanding. She had already learned what war meant. One night, when the stars were hidden by clouds, he gave her a test. A small beast, wounded but alive, lay nearby. He told her to kill it. No reason. No reward, just to see what she would do. She walked to it slowly, sat beside it, watched it breathe. Then she placed her hand on its chest and whispered something he couldn't hear. And the beast died. Not in pain, not in fear, just stopped. Bane said nothing. But inside him, something shifted. This child did not seek destruction. But when asked, she delivered it without question, without pleasure. What did that mean? Was she already beyond the teachings he had learned in pain? Or was she something entirely different? Days passed, and she never asked why he had chosen her, not once. Most children would have begged for answers, for safety, for warmth. But Rain asked for nothing. She followed where he walked, listened when he spoke, and when he was silent, she mirrored him. At night Bane would study her in the firelight. Her face was still young, still soft, but her eyes belonged to someone who had seen too much. They didn't shine with curiosity. They didn't flicker with fear. They just watched, like they were waiting for the truth behind everything to finally reveal itself. And that unsettled him. Not because he feared her, but because she reminded him of something he had long forgotten. He remembered what it felt like to be alone, to be betrayed, to be called weak by those who pretended to serve truth. The Jedi had lied to him. The Sith before him had lied too. That's why he had torn it all down. The Brotherhood of Darkness. The false chains of tradition. He had created something new, the rule of two, one to hold the power, one to crave it. But this child, she did not crave. Not yet. Could that be dangerous? He began to teach her, not with kindness, not with structure, but with quiet. He would speak only once. If she remembered, she passed. If she forgot, he did not repeat himself. She never forgot. He taught her how to feel the Force, not just as a tool, but as a weight. He showed her how anger sharpened instinct, how fear could be turned into clarity. He spoke of pain not as punishment, but as proof. Pain was the mark of survival. And Rain listened, always. But she didn't ask questions, and that silence grew louder than words. He wondered, did she already understand these things? Had the Force taught her before he arrived? One morning, as light spilled through the gaps in the trees, he told her to build a weapon. Not a lightsaber. Not yet. Just something sharp, something that could cut. She gathered pieces without speaking. Bone, stone, twine from broken roots. By evening she returned with a blade so clean it reflected the clouds. He asked her if she had ever made one before. She said no, but it had felt familiar. He asked how she knew what to do. She shrugged, then looked toward the trees. They told me, she said. Bane turned but saw no one. She didn't mean the trees, of course. She meant something deeper, older, the Force, or something beneath it. Could it be that she was hearing echoes of the ancient Sith, not as lessons but as memories, whispers that only she could translate? He remembered the first time he had touched true darkness. It had burned through him, wild and sharp, forcing him to bend or be broken. But she moved through it like she belonged. She had not been trained. She had been claimed. And he began to wonder if this girl had found the dark before he ever found her. Bane had lived long enough to see deception in every form. He had learned that the Force didn't offer gifts. It tested, it punished, and it waited. Power was not given freely. It was taken, earned, demanded through pain. Yet with Rain, it felt different. She didn't seize the Force. She welcomed it, like an old friend returning after a long journey. And when she moved, it followed, quietly, naturally, as if it had been part of her since birth, or perhaps since before. He began to keep distance, not out of fear, but reflection. There was something in her presence that made him question not his beliefs, not his path, but his place. If she truly was what he suspected, then the rule of two had already begun to change, not in structure, but in meaning. Was she the student? Or was she the future? He remembered the old Sith Lords, their stories, their obsessions, their downfalls. Power had devoured them. Arrogance had blinded them. But Rain didn't hunger. She didn't speak of ruling or revenge or conquest. She asked about silence, about feeling the planet breathe, about how the Force could be loud one day and soft the next. She said the dark wasn't cruel, it was just alone. And that line stayed with him, because he had always believed the dark was a weapon, something to wield, something to control. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just waiting to be understood? Rain continued her lessons without complaint. She didn't flinch when the training became harsh. She didn't cry when her body ached. And when he left her in the cold to meditate for hours, she never once begged for it to end. She simply endured, not to impress him, not to earn favor, but because she didn't know any other way. Bane began to see it clearly. She wasn't meant to be like him. She wasn't his mirror. She wasn't shaped by betrayal or rage. Her path was quieter, slower, but just as sharp. He began to think of her not as a child, not even as an apprentice, but as a successor. Could it be that the Force had not chosen him to rebuild the Sith, but had only used him to deliver her? He didn't speak this thought aloud, because part of him feared it, and part of him believed it. One night, as they watched distant storms roll across the valley, she asked a question for the first time. "What happens if I grow stronger than you?" He turned to face her. There was no challenge in her voice, no defiance, just a quiet curiosity. He told her that if that day came, it would be her right to strike him down. She nodded, then turned back to the sky. No fear, no doubt, just understanding, and in that stillness he knew the truth. The rule of two was not his legacy, it was hers. The old ways had died with the Brotherhood. That was Bane's belief. The Sith, in his eyes, had become too many, too loud, too reckless. Power had been shared, diluted, until no one held it fully, and so he had destroyed them, all of them. From the ashes he would rebuild a new order, quiet, focused, patient. He called it the rule of two. One to hold the power, one to crave it. And in this new order, Zannah was the beginning. She didn't become his apprentice with ceremony. There was no ritual, no vow. One day he handed her a book, old, weathered, filled with symbols that seemed to shift when touched. He told her to read, to understand, to learn, not because he said so, but because power waited within it. If she wanted to find it, she would have to reach for it herself. She took the book without speaking. She didn't ask for help, didn't ask what it meant. And that was when her training began. At first, the lessons were silent. Bane spoke little, only when necessary. He believed words could distract, that true power grew in solitude. So Zannah watched. She learned by noticing the way his eyes moved when he sensed danger, the way his voice changed when he spoke to the Force. She listened to the pauses, the stillness between thoughts, and in those spaces she found understanding. Her path was not like his. Bane was strength, sharp, clear, and direct. Zannah was something else. She moved like thought, quiet, gentle, but underneath her calm was a storm, not of fire, but of shadows. He taught her how to shape her anger, not to release it, but to hold it, to let it simmer, to keep it just beneath the skin. She learned to bend her fear into awareness, to fold her pain into clarity. These were not lessons for children, but she was no longer a child. One evening, as dusk fell over their hidden dwelling, Bane spoke of the Sith that came before. He described them not with pride, but with disappointment. Their arrogance, their chaos, their endless wars for control. He told her they were fools, all of them, even the great ones. She asked him why he believed that. He said because they died for nothing. She didn't answer, not out of obedience, but because she wasn't sure he was right. Something about their stories stayed with her, not the battles or the victories, but the silence after, the loneliness in their ends. Had they really been fools, or had they been something else? Something the galaxy couldn't understand. She didn't argue, she only listened, but inside questions began to grow. Could it be that Bane's vision, as strong as it was still only one vision? And if so, what was hers? The nights grew longer in that part of the galaxy. Stars hung lower, the cold clung harder, and the silence between master and apprentice stretched further. But Zannah never pulled away. She remained close, like a shadow that moved when he moved, paused when he paused, and watched when he believed she was sleeping. But she was always listening, always thinking. She did not question the rule of two, not aloud. She understood its shape, one to hold the power, one to crave it. And yet when she repeated the words in her mind, something always caught, the word crave, as if wanting was the engine of destiny, as if hunger alone made someone worthy. But what if someone didn't crave power, and still became powerful. What if the Force chose differently? Darth Bane believed in structure. His teachings were sharp, his will absolute. He taught her to hide in plain sight, to use lies as weapons, to let others destroy themselves while she watched. She learned quickly, not because she wanted to impress him, but because it made sense. Subtlety was not weakness, it was survival. He also introduced her to Sith magic. Not tricks, not illusions, real things, ancient things, forgotten by most, feared by all. The first time she touched that part of the Force, it did not feel violent. It felt familiar, as if her mind had already known how to bend it, long before her hands tried. She didn't ask how he found these secrets. She only wanted to see if they would speak to her too. And they did. She began to shape thoughts, not just weapons. She learned how to use doubt as a tool, how to place fear gently into someone's mind without ever lifting a blade. Her power was soft, but precise. Where Bane broke walls, Zannah found doors. One night while meditating near a river carved into the rock, she felt something strange. A whisper not from Bane, not from the air, but from beneath her skin. A pull, a call. It led her into memory, not her own, but someone else's. A Sith, long dead. A spell half-formed. It didn't frighten her. It welcomed her. She followed it, and the Force changed around her. When she told Bane, he did not show surprise, only interest. He asked what she saw. She said, "Not light, not dark, just will." He nodded, and then he said something she didn't expect. "You may one day surpass me." She didn't then respond, but later in silence, she thought about it. Not with pride, but with quiet knowing. Because deep inside her, she already had. She just wasn't set ready to show it. Yet, Zannah's power grew in stillness, not in grand displays or public battles, but in the way she stood quietly at the edge of things, watching how the world moved and learning where to press. She began to see what Bane did not always see, the places where control could be found without force, where people could be led without knowing they were being led. She didn't just study sorcery or Sith texts. She studied people, their fears, their desires, their weaknesses. She understood that fear wasn't just a weapon, it was a language, and she learned how to speak it. Bane, meanwhile, continued to shape the future with heavy hands. He looked outward, toward empires yet to rise, toward legacies not yet written. He trained her to build that future, to prepare for it. But he never asked what kind of future she saw when she closed her eyes. And she never told him. Because hers was different. He saw a galaxy ruled by strength. She saw one ruled by thought. He believed in challenge, in the apprentice rising through violence. But Zannah, she believed in waiting. Because time was the truest test. She could see the cracks in Bane's beliefs. He spoke of patience, but feared stillness. He spoke of power, but worried he'd lose it. He watched her now more than ever, not with concern, but with caution. He saw what she was becoming, and though he never said it, part of him wondered whether she still craved, or whether she had already claimed. There were nights when he would speak of the future, of what must come next, how she would one day take an apprentice of her own, how the line of Sith would continue. She would nod, say little, and store the words away. Not because she disagreed, but because her path would not be his. It would be quieter, sharper, stronger in ways he did not yet understand. She began to train alone, often beyond his sight. Deep caves, abandoned ruins, places where voices echoed too long. She whispered spells under her breath, shaping the force with intent so precise it felt like a blade passing through mist. She practiced not only what Bane had given her, but what the force itself offered in its darkest, most secret corners. And the force responded, sometimes with pain, sometimes with visions, sometimes with silence so complete it felt like falling into a void. But she never turned back, because something inside her was beginning to settle, not in comfort but in certainty. She wasn't just learning the rule of two. She was redefining it, not to break it, but to perfect it. She didn't want to replace Bane yet. She didn't want to kill him, not because she couldn't, but because the time wasn't right. And time was her greatest ally. So she waited, not in shadows, but in plain sight, beside the one who had given her the rule that she would one day make her own. The days turned hard, not in body but in mind. Bane's training wasn't about lightsaber forms or endless duels. It wasn't meant to build muscle or teach her how to survive in the wild. It was about breaking pieces of her and watching which ones she put back together. He didn't offer praise. He didn't offer warning, only silence and pressure. Each day began with thought, not meditation. Thought. Focus on pain. Focus on memory. Focus on failure. Zannah was told to recall every moment she had been weak, every time she had needed someone and been left alone. He told her to hold on to those feelings, not to push them away. He told her that the Sith did not destroy their pain. They shaped it like stone under fire. Zannah did as she was told. She closed her eyes and returned to Ruwasan, to the trees, to the screams, to the moment she realized she'd been abandoned. And when she opened her eyes again, the world looked sharper, colder, more real. Bane watched her, always at a distance. He would strike when she was distracted, speak when she was calm, tear into her lessons the moment she thought she understood. This wasn't just to test her memory. It was to see how she responded when the ground beneath her moved without warning. Sometimes he insulted her, said she lacked will, that her strength was borrowed, not earned. He told her she clung too much to memory, that true Sith had no past, only future. She didn't argue, but inside her thoughts burned, because she believed something different, that the past was where power began. That pain didn't need to be erased, only understood. He took her to old places, caves where light couldn't reach, temples long buried under dirt and silence. He made her kneel before altars that pulsed with old energy and listen for hours without speaking. Sometimes the Force screamed at her in those places. Sometimes it said nothing. But she stayed always. Even when blood ran from her nose, even when her fingers trembled, Bane never comforted her. He only said, "Good, it tests listening." And Zannah knew he didn't mean the Force. He meant the darkness. He began to show her pages that looked more like wounds than writing. Sith texts written in blood, in languages that didn't follow rules. She would stare at them until her eyes ached, until the words blurred and rearranged themselves, until something inside her shifted, like a door slowly creaking open. The first time she read one of the spells aloud, the air in the room turned to ice. The fire near her flickered blue, then vanished. Her voice, soft and steady, seemed to echo back at her from the walls. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Bane said very quietly, "Again?" And she did. Again and again. Each time, the cold went deeper. Each time she felt less alone, because something in the shadows was listening, and maybe even answering. Zannah's body remained small, but her presence had changed. She no longer followed behind Bane. She walked beside him, though he never said whether he noticed. Her strength didn't show in posture or glare. It lived in her stillness, the kind that made even silence feel heavier. The rituals became more dangerous. Bane had her summon images from places she had never been, speak names she had never heard. One spell left her shaking for hours, her hands covered in black lines that faded only when she stopped thinking about them. She didn't understand how they worked, only that when she believed in them, they obeyed, and when she doubted, they didn't. He told her that Sith sorcery wasn't about saying the right words. It was about bending the will of the Force, not asking, commanding. But Zannah started to wonder, was that all it was? Because sometimes when she stood alone, the Force came to her, not through control, not through fury, but through quiet understanding. It brought her thoughts she hadn't asked for, emotions she hadn't called. It was like it knew her, not just what she wanted, but what she feared. And that fear became a mirror. Bane pushed her to use it. He believed that fear, when shaped, became a weapon. He taught her how to create illusions, not tricks, but living nightmares. One night, he brought a prisoner to a stone chamber carved beneath their hiding place. He told her to break his mind without touching him. She stepped into the room, looked at the man's eyes, and said a word she didn't know she remembered. He screamed. For 3 hours. When it was over, Bane said nothing, just nodded. But Zannah did not sleep that night. Not out of guilt, but because something in her had changed. The magic didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt familiar, like it had been waiting for her, like it had always been part of her blood, and now it had been woken up. Sometimes in dreams she heard voices whispering her name, not Rain, not the name of a lost child, but Zannah, strong, clear, as if the Force itself had accepted what she was becoming. She began to ask questions, not aloud but inside. Was this what Bane wanted? A student who learned faster than expected. A partner who could one day replace him, sooner than he thought. Or was this part of his plan? Had he always known she would change the order he was building? And if so, did he truly want that? She began to write her own thoughts in the margins of the Sith texts, not in rebellion, not in defiance, but as reflections, new ideas, new shapes. What if the rule of 2 was more than a chain? What if it was a cycle? One to rise, one to fall. Not by violence, but by choice. And somewhere in that thought, she felt something settle inside her. Not ambition, but destiny. Bane's voice grew quieter in her mind, not because he spoke less, but because Zannah began to hear something else, something older, something deeper. In the silence between her thoughts, she started to feel the Force not as an energy to be bent, but as a presence that responded to emotion more than command. Rage stirred it, but so did sorrow, so did silence. She didn't tell Bane. Some things weren't for sharing. He still tested her, still believed that pain would shape her future. Once he took her to a ruin where the walls bled heat and the floor hummed with buried bones. He left her there with no food, no tools, only a single command: survive. She stayed for 3 days. By the end, the air around her had changed. It pulsed. It listened. She walked out without a wound, but her eyes looked like they had seen something no one else could see. Bane didn't praise her, but he didn't test her again. Not like that. She began to understand him more. The man behind the armor, behind the cruelty. He wasn't trying to make her him. He was trying to see if she would stay herself, if she could hold on to who she was while learning who she might become. And she did. But something else happened too. She started to feel separate. Still his apprentice, still loyal in form, but her thoughts began to run in different directions. She saw futures where she didn't follow his path, not out of disobedience, but because her own steps led elsewhere. She imagined a Sith order not built on destruction, but on influence, not on bloodshed, but on control. What if the next Sith didn't rule from the shadows, but from within the systems the Jedi thought they owned, not with sabers drawn, but with words, with fear, with belief? Could it be that power didn't need to scream to be absolute? And if that was true, what did that make her? Each night she sat with her spells, rewriting them in smaller, tighter ways, not louder, quieter, stronger in form, cleaner in result. She didn't crave fire, she craved precision, the ability to pull someone apart with a thought, not to make them suffer, but to make them understand. Bane watched her grow, and though he said little, Zannah began to sense the tension. It wasn't fear, not yet, but awareness. He could feel the space between them widening, the shift in power. He knew that the rule demanded one to fall, but did he think it would be him? She wasn't set sure, because in truth she didn't yet know either. Was she rising out of loyalty? Or was she becoming something even he hadn't planned? Maybe she was not his successor. Maybe she was his ending. But not yet. Because still she waited. Waited until the Force whispered more than questions. Waited until the darkness was not just her tool, but her voice. And when that day came, she would no longer be learning. She would be becoming. The first time Zannah left Bane's side, the silence felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just different. The space around her felt wider, the choices heavier. There was no voice to correct her, no shadow behind her steps, just her, the Force, and the weight of what she had been sent to do. Serenno was not a battlefield. It was polished, elegant, sharp in ways that weren't seen at first glance. The nobles here didn't fight with weapons. They fought with names, with secrets, with whispers traded behind velvet curtains and in marble halls. Zannah didn't arrive with fire. She arrived with patience. Her mission was simple, at least in words. Disrupt, divide, feed the cracks in the power structure, let it fall from within. But what she truly carried wasn't a task. It was a question. Could she do what Bane would have done, but in her own way? She wore no cloak of power. She moved as a commoner, eyes lowered, footsteps quiet, but her mind was sharp, and her presence, though unseen, began to settle into the halls of Serenno like a scent no one could place. She listened first. Spent days walking the streets, sitting in corners of busy markets, following conversations without being followed herself. She watched noble houses prepare for their ceremonies, for their alliances, for their quiet wars of pride and wealth. She saw the pressure points before she ever spoke a word. Then she began. A bribe, placed not as a demand, but as a suggestion. A rumor whispered to the wrong person at exactly the right moment. A letter forged to look like it came from a trusted hand. None of these actions drew attention. Not at first, but slowly the balance began to shift. Friends became unsure. Allies began to doubt. And Zannah smiled, though only on the inside. She stayed in a quiet home on the outskirts of the capital, her presence cloaked, her identity hidden. But every night she returned to the Force, not for guidance but for clarity. She would reach out, not far, just enough to feel the tension tightening across the noble lines, and it was there, like a string being pulled, not all at once, but inch by inch. One morning, a duel was called between two powerful houses. It made no sense. Their alliance had lasted generations, but both sides believed betrayal had already begun. Neither of them knew who had started it. Neither of them knew she existed. When the duel ended, one heir lay dead, and behind that single blade stroke lay 20 of her words placed over 10 days, each softer than the one before. Zannah did not kill with violence. She killed with silence. And as the blood spread across the courtyard stones, she was already gone. Not far, just further than blame could reach. But in her absence, something had been left behind. Not just death, not just fear, but confusion. And it spread faster than she expected. The chaos didn't come all at once. It arrived like fog, seeping into places it didn't belong, touching people who hadn't yet realized they were part of something larger. After the duel, Sereno's court didn't erupt. It hesitated. People whispered more quietly, watched more carefully, and smiled a little less. But beneath every greeting was a question. Who moved first? Zannah had done more than spark a conflict. She had rearranged the rules. Nobles who once trusted their bloodlines began to check their own walls for cracks. Alliances formed in secret, some real, some imagined. Old rivalries reignited, not with swords but with suspicion. And she was still there, not as a player, as a shadow. She sent forged messages between houses, small changes, a date moved, a meeting rescheduled, a name added or removed. Sometimes, all it took was one sentence written in the wrong handwriting, one wrong seal, one delayed delivery, and something that once held power unraveled. But she didn't do it for thrill. There was no pride. She didn't smile when people fought or died. She only watched, measured, learned. Because this wasn't set about Sereno. It was about her. Could she truly move the world around her without being seen? Could she control without control? The test wasn't set, the chaos itself. It was how long she could keep her hand invisible. She began planting contradictions, paying one house to accuse another, then paying the accused to defend the one who had betrayed them. Information became a maze. Every truth was wrapped in lies, and every lie carried just enough truth to feel real. One senator wrote a speech about peace and reform. 2 days later, his guards turned against him in his sleep. They believed he had arranged their deaths. He hadn't. Zannah had, but only through the smallest gesture. A name slipped into a ledger, a look exchanged at the wrong moment, and a single line spoken by someone who didn't know they were part of anything. She began to see how fragile order truly was. Not because it was weak, but because it trusted itself too much. And this, she realized, was her true power. Not the spells, not the magic, not even the force. It was her mind, her patience, her understanding of fear. It moved through Sereno like wind through tall grass, quiet, constant, changing everything but leaving nothing to hold on to. Bane didn't send word. He didn't ask for updates. But she knew he was watching. Somehow, she could feel it, not with her senses, but with her instincts. The way the air would pause, the way her breath felt heavier. He wasn't interfering. He was waiting, maybe to see if she would fail. Or maybe to see if she would go too far. The final move was never loud. It came in the form of a treaty, clean, well-worded, reasonable, signed by the heads of 4 noble houses, each believing they were outmaneuvering the others, each thinking they had control of what came next. But none of them had written the first draft. None of them had truly started the conversation. It had come to them anonymously. But each one had assumed it was their own idea. That was the beauty of it. Zannah's work did not burn cities. It did not leave banners in its wake. It left confusion and questions no one could answer. Who had broken the alliances? Why had long-held trusts collapsed? How had so many careful decisions led to so much quiet destruction? The treaty did not last. Within weeks, 2 of the houses had turned again. One leader vanished. Another confessed to crimes they had never committed, driven mad by whispers only they could hear. A third found their own staff slowly turning away, not with rebellion, but with doubt. And Zannah was already gone, back through the lower streets, through doorways no one watched, back into silence. When she returned to Bane, she did not kneel. She did not speak of what she had done. She stood before him with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. He asked no questions, only looked at her for a long time, then turned away, because he already knew. And that quiet turn, that absence of praise, that absence of criticism, was louder than any approval. She had done what he asked, but not how he would have done it. Not with fear, with control, with silence. And something shifted between them. Not yet tension, but understanding that she no longer needed permission to act, that the rule of 2 wasn't a command. It was a challenge. Later that night, alone with her thoughts, Zannah watched a single candle flicker. The flame bent with each breath in the room, swaying like it was listening to something unspoken. She thought about the people of Sereno, how they still searched for the source of their collapse. They didn't know her name. They never would. And that was perfect. Because power, real power, didn't always wear a face. Sometimes it only left behind shadows. And in those shadows, doubt grew. And from that doubt, destiny. Zannah closed her eyes, not to rest, but to listen, to feel, to remember every move she had made, every thread she had pulled, every mind she had touched without ever being seen. Had she learned too well? Or had she become exactly what Bane had hoped for? Maybe both, but deep inside, where even her thoughts dared not speak too loudly, another question waited. Was she still the apprentice? Or had the balance already begun to shift? The room was dark, even by Sith standards. Not the darkness of a place without light, but the kind that felt alive, the kind that pressed against skin like breath. Zannah sat alone on the stone floor, her knees folded beneath her, her fingers tracing slow patterns across the dusty script carved into the surface. It was an ancient tongue, one that spoke not to her ears, but to her blood. She didn't flinch when the shadows moved. She had learned by now, not everything that moved in silence meant harm. Sometimes it simply meant watching, and these shadows had been watching her for a long time. Bane had shown her the entry point, years ago, a doorway into something deeper than the Force most Jedi knew. Sith sorcery was older than the Republic, older than the lightsabers they now all clung to. It was not a power of the body. It was a war of the mind, of fear, of memory, of truth twisted and turned until it became something else. And it was here in this stillness that Zannah found her real strength. She didn't need to raise her voice to summon it. She didn't chant loudly or draw circles of fire. She whispered, just once. The syllables came like breath, soft, clear, and the air around her changed. Slowly, the lines in the stone began to glow, faintly at first, then steady. Not with light, but with meaning. She wasn't casting a spell. She was becoming one. It wasn't just illusion. It wasn't trickery. It was connection, her mind reaching into the mind of another, guiding their thoughts just far enough off balance to open the door for fear. Once the fear entered, the rest came easy. Doubt, confusion, pain. She didn't always enjoy it, but she always understood it. Because the power of Sith sorcery wasn't in what it did to others, it was in what it revealed about yourself. Bane had taught her the basics, but what she pursued now went beyond his reach. He still believed in strength, raw, sharp, direct, but Zannah had begun to feel something deeper, a presence beneath the Force, like a second current, colder and slower, but stronger, one that asked not for control, but for understanding. She read more than she spoke, she listened more than she moved, and through her quiet study, she began to unlock spells even Bane hadn't touched. At first he allowed it, but as her knowledge grew, something changed. His questions became more frequent, his silence more measured. He watched her not as a teacher, but as someone watching the edge of something they didn't fully know. Could it be that Bane feared what she was learning? Not because it threatened him directly, but because it didn't come from him. She didn't challenge him, not yet, but she didn't hide either. She left her texts out in the open. She let her spells hum gently through the walls when she slept. She wanted him to know, not out of pride, but as a signal, that she was ready for more, that there were things in the Force he hadn't touched, but she had. And they whispered to her now, clearer than ever, not as masters, but as equals. The deeper she reached into the ancient spells, the more the Force began to change around her. It no longer moved like wind or water. It thickened, slowed, gathered in corners of rooms, behind words, inside breath. When Zannah spoke now, even in casual conversation, her voice carried something beneath it. A weight, a quiet gravity. People paused when she entered rooms, though they didn't know why. Even Bane, though he never said so, noticed it. He had once told her that power was only real when it was tested. That strength meant nothing unless it was stronger than someone else's. But Zannah had begun to see power differently. True strength didn't need to dominate. It simply needed to be undeniable. The mind was her battlefield, and in that space she was unmatched. She began crafting spells that didn't hurt the body at all. Ones that planted fears in a person's mind so softly that they believed they had always been there. She could make a soldier forget how to hold a weapon, make a Jedi see the face of a lost loved one in every shadow. And she did it with a calmness that almost made her invisible. One man, a former Republic investigator who had started asking questions about her identity, fell into madness after a brief conversation with her in a quiet corridor. He screamed of voices in mirrors, faces watching him from the walls. No one could explain it. No one even remembered seeing her there. But she had been, for less than 2 minutes, and that was all it took. Bane began setting boundaries, soft ones, suggestions disguised as commands. Leave this scroll untouched. Don't attempt this rite without me present. She obeyed, but only on the surface. Because something inside her had shifted, she no longer needed his permission, and she no longer needed to wait. Still, she said nothing. She continued the lessons. Let him believe the pace was his. But deep in her own chambers, where the walls were marked with old symbols and the air carried whispers too faint for most to hear, she studied alone. And there in the cold, in the quiet, she discovered something unexpected. Not power, but presence. It was as if the ancient Sith who had written these texts had left pieces of themselves behind. Not ghosts, not spirits, but thoughts, emotions, regrets. They didn't speak in words, they moved in feeling. When she reached into the pages, she didn't just read. She remembered things that weren't hers, battles, choices, mistakes. Could it be that the dark side didn't just echo through history, but remembered? And if so, what did it mean that it was remembering her? She didn't tell Bane, because this wasn't set his path. It was hers. And for the first time, she began to wonder not if she would surpass him, but if she already had, just in a way he couldn't see. There was a moment one night, quiet, still, without meaning at first, when Zannah stood at the edge of the outer hall and watched Bane from a distance. He was meditating, his form rigid, breath measured. Around him, the force pulsed with his presence, heavy and unyielding. Once she had looked upon that strength with awe. Now she saw it differently. It was not lesser, but it was known. Bane's power lived in control, in dominance, in the precision of fear. He had broken worlds, ended legacies, rewritten the Sith in his own image. But that image had edges, limits, rules. Zannah Sip's path had no such shape. She turned away before he could notice her watching. But as she walked back to her chamber, she carried something she hadn't felt before. Not ambition. Clarity. She began to write her own spellbook, not copied from the ancient texts, but born from them. She didn't need to repeat what had already been done. She was building something new, something quieter, less visible, but far more dangerous. Her illusions no longer required full attention. She could speak a phrase under her breath and watch someone forget their own name. She could move through a crowd, and by the time she passed, each person would remember her face differently. Not wrong, just altered, shifted. And in battle, her mind became a mirror. She could show her enemy their greatest fear, not as a hallucination, but as reality. Their hands would tremble, their thoughts would turn. Some would beg, others would break. She never needed to touch them. And this, more than anything, began to change the way she viewed Bane's teachings. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. She began to see her own power, not as a challenge to him, but as a shadow beside his light, not opposite, but surrounding. Could it be that the rule of two wasn't just about succession? Could it be a dialogue? Each master teaching a lesson the apprentice would someday rewrite. Each apprentice holding knowledge the master would never fully understand. Bane still believed in her, still trained her, still watched her grow. But Zannah had stopped growing for him. She grew now for herself. And in her growth, something unspoken lingered. A question neither of them dared voice. When the day came, the day one must fall, would it be a battle? Or something far more quiet? Would she need to raise her blade? Or had the darkness already chosen? Late one evening, as the stars pulsed cold in the sky, Zannah stood alone with her hands outstretched. The force moved through her, not as a storm, but as a whisper. Not loud, but certain, and in that whisper was a promise. That when the time came, she would not need to fight for the future, because she was already becoming it. Bane stood longer in silence now, not in meditation, but in thought. His body, once a weapon honed to carve through armies, had begun to slow. Not by much, not enough to admit, but the signs were there. The pain in his joints after long travel, the way his breath caught for a second too long when he summoned the Force, and more than that, the way he looked at Zannah. Not with pride, but with doubt. She felt it, even when he said nothing, especially when he said nothing. His gaze lingered differently, studying her not as a teacher, but as someone measuring the edge of a blade they might one day face. And yet there was something else in that silence. Disappointment. He believed she had grown strong, but not decisive. Patient, but not ruthless. Brilliant, but not dangerous enough. Because she hadn't tried to kill him. Not yet. And so he began to wonder if she ever would. Zannah noticed the change in small things first. The way he delayed their training sessions. The questions he asked less about the dark side, more about her intentions. "What do you seek, Zannah?" he asked one night, as they walked a quiet corridor of stone. She didn't answer, because the truth would be too revealing, and a lie would only draw him closer to the truth. She could feel him drifting, not away from her teachings, but from his trust in her. And slowly, without saying so, he began searching for something else. Someone else. Zannah sensed it before she saw it. He had been watching a soldier in a distant system, a young man who had survived an ambush that should have killed him, who had turned on his own officers and lived. Bane called it instinct, called it potential. But Zannah saw it for what it was. A replacement. And in that moment, the tension between them stopped being hidden. It simply remained unspoken. She began to plan, not out of anger, not even out of fear, but because she had to, because she knew something Bane had forgotten, that the rule of two wasn't set about loyalty. It was about survival. And survival required vision, not only for the moment you strike, but for everything that must come after. Their conversations turned colder, not in tone but in what was left unsaid. Every word between them carried weight, as if a single sentence could tip the balance. Zannah no longer asked questions. Bane no longer offered instruction. They spoke like two figures standing at the edge of a narrow bridge, both waiting for the other to step forward first. She began to study his movements again, not like a student but like a rival. The way he leaned on his left side when rising, the stiffness in his right hand after long hours of channeling the Force. Small things, invisible to most, but not to her. He had taught her to observe, to understand weakness, and now he was teaching her something else. How to hide his own. The name spoke often now of legacy, not directly but through metaphor. Power must live beyond the body, he said, one evening. Otherwise all we build dies with us. Zannah nodded, but behind her calm, her mind raced. She knew where this led. He wanted to survive, beyond death. Not through her, but through essence, through transfer. He had discovered a ritual, old, forbidden, a way to move his spirit into a new vessel. Not to die, but to continue. He hadn't asked her to submit. Not yet, but the possibility was there, thick in the air between them. She wondered, would he truly try? Would he one day stand before her, not with a blade but with a spell, and take from her what he could not defeat? And if so, would she be ready? She began layering protections into her mind, memories shielded beneath spells, emotional anchors hidden in quiet thoughts, not shields, traps. If he tried to enter her mind, he wouldn't find fear. He would find reflection. And in that mirror, maybe even he would falter. Still, she said nothing, because words were weapons, and hers were not yet drawn. She watched as he traveled more, returning later each time. His presence returned with shadows attached, other Force users he had tested, studied, discarded. He hadn't said it aloud, but she knew. He no longer trusted her path, because her path was no longer his. And so the bond between them thinned, not broken, but stretched, like thread over flame. Each step she took in solitude, each scroll she read alone, became a declaration, quiet but final. He was no longer her master, and she was no longer his student. She was simply waiting for the day their silence would speak for them. The room where she kept her private writings was colder now, not by temperature, but by presence. The air felt thinner. Time moved slower. She had marked the walls with runes that only she could read, not to protect the space, but to remind herself that here in this quiet her future was already forming. Every decision she made now carried weight. Every movement rehearsed, every breath deliberate. Bane was watching. He always had been, but now he was watching for weakness. And Zannah gave him none. He still tested her. He still trained, but his words carried doubt. Praise became rare, and when it came, it arrived with questions hidden beneath. "You learn quickly," he said. Then softly, "But do you understand what it means to finish?" Zannah didn't respond, because she already knew what it meant to finish. She had been preparing for it. And so had he. They passed each other like stars in orbit, never colliding, but always pulled toward the inevitable. She didn't want to rush. Timing mattered. To strike too early would mean failure. To wait too long could mean everything would be taken from her. So she waited for the right moment. And while she waited, she studied him. Not as her master, but as her target. Could it be that Bane knew she was already stronger? And if so, why hadn't he attacked? Was it pride? Or fear? Or perhaps hope that she might still surprise him? That she might still choose to become his vessel instead of his end? Zannah considered it, not because she would surrender, but because she wanted to understand the shape of the question. What was the rule of two, if not a question wrapped in blood? Two must exist, but only one survives. Not because one kills, but because one becomes more than both. And maybe that was the answer Bane had never seen. She didn't need to destroy him to win. She needed to become something he could never be. She needed to carry the Sith forward, without looking back. And when that day arrived, the day of silence, the day when no words would be spoken, only power exchanged, she wouldn't hesitate, because she had already said goodbye. Not aloud, but in the way she walked beside him, in the way her thoughts moved in places his could no longer reach, in the way her future no longer needed his past. And so the whispers of rebellion became something else. Not noise, not betrayal, but transformation. The quiet, final truth of the rule of two. That love, trust, fear, none of it mattered. Only the shadow that remained. Only the will that survived. And Zannah would survive. It began without ceremony. No storm, no fire, no crowds, just two Sith, and the silence that stretched between them. The place they chose was old, forgotten by time and buried beneath stone. Its walls carried the weight of ancient voices, their echoes smoothed by centuries. Zannah arrived first. She didn't pace, she didn't breathe heavily. She stood still, as if she had always been there. Bane followed moments later, though it felt like the moment had been waiting far longer. They didn't speak right away. There was no need. The words had already been said, scattered in glances, sharpened in doubt, whispered in the dark between their training. Every lesson, every silence, every question unasked, it all led here. He studied her the way he had done when she was a child, when her name had been Rain, when her power was raw and undefined. But now she stood as more than a reflection of him. She was not a weapon he forged. She was a blade he could no longer hold. And still, a part of him hesitated. Did he believe he could win? Or had he already chosen to lose, just on his own terms? Zannah didn't hesitate, because her path had been quiet, but certain. She did not crave this moment, but she had accepted it long ago. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady. "You've known this day would come." Bane said nothing, but his silence agreed. She took a step forward, and that was when the force shifted. Not violently, but like breath held too long. He moved first, not out of rage, not out of fear, out of purpose. His strikes were precise, heavy, meant to end quickly. He had no desire to drag this out. But Zannah didn't meet him with resistance. She moved like wind, bending, slipping, watching. She wasn't trying to overpower him. She was trying to understand him. Because this wasn't just a battle. It was a conversation. And she was listening. Their lightsabers clashed only a handful of times, but each moment stretched. Each movement carried a lifetime of meaning. Bane fought with the strength of a warrior who had shaped the Sith with his bare hands. Every strike was history. Every turn was legacy. But Zannah didn't meet strength with strength. She answered it with control. She let him believe he was leading. Let him believe she was backing away. But beneath her steps, she was building something unseen. Threads of power, drawn not from the Force as it moved through violence, but from the Force as it moved through memory. Her mind reached into his, slowly, carefully. And Bane felt it, not like a sharp intrusion, but like a question rising inside him. Was he sure? Was he still certain of everything? Because Zannah was just fighting his body. She was fighting his certainty. He pushed harder, his attacks more aggressive, his breath deeper, voice lower. But she absorbed it all, like water catching flame. Her hand never shook, her eyes never blinked, and when she whispered the first spell, ancient, hidden, shaped in silence, the space around them seemed to bend. His mind flinched, just enough. And in that moment, she stepped through his guard. Not with her blade, but with her will. The spell wasn't one of fire or lightning. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to show. She placed his thoughts in front of him, held up his fears like a mirror. The years slipping past, the apprentices who failed him, the question he never spoke, had he built a legacy, or only delayed extinction? He staggered, only for a breath. But Zannah saw it. She didn't press forward. She waited. And Bane, for the first time, hesitated. Not because she was stronger, but because she knew him too well. Maybe that was the danger he hadn't seen, that the apprentice didn't have to surpass the master with strength, only with understanding. He came at her again, not in anger, but in silence. His strikes were slower now, not weaker, but more careful. He had felt the edge of something he couldn't name, and that was where Zannah lived, in the space between what could be known and what could only be feared. She let him come closer, let him swing, let him breathe, and then she closed her eyes. Not in surrender, in focus. She spoke the second spell without sound. It didn't twist the room or darken the sky. It turned inward into his thoughts, into the places Bane had sealed off even from himself. And suddenly he was somewhere else. Not in a battle, not in a temple, but in memory. He stood again in the mines where his pain began, felt the chains on his arms, smelled the sweat, the blood, the hopelessness. He saw the faces of the men he had killed, the ones he left behind, and behind all of it, his own reflection, alone, always alone. He cried out, only once, but that was enough. When the world snapped back, Zannah was still standing. He looked at her, not with hatred, but with recognition. She hadn't defeated him with power. She had revealed him to himself. And maybe that had always been his weakness. The duel didn't end with a scream. It didn't end with a final blow. It ended in silence. His body fell, but the story didn't yet. Because even as she stood over him, even as the dust settled and her breath steadied, Zannah felt something shift inside her. Not just victory, presence. A flicker of something that didn't fully vanish. Could it be that Bane had survived? Not in form, but in thought, in spirit, in her. Some say his essence tried to take hold of her in those final moments, that his soul, desperate to live, latched onto hers, that the battle never truly ended. It simply moved inward. And maybe that's why she stood so still afterward, not to celebrate, but to listen, to check if she was still alone. She never said what happened that day, never told another soul if she had won entirely or if she had become something else. But from that moment forward, her presence changed. Heavier, quieter, more precise. She walked away from the temple without looking back, not because there was nothing left to see, but because the past no longer needed her attention. She carried it now. All of it. The rule of two, the legacy of the Sith, and maybe Bane himself, not as her master, but as her echo. Zannah stood in silence, her cloak catching the soft wind rising from the cliffs below. The battle was over. The echoes of her duel with Bane still lingered in her bones, not from injury, but from something colder, deeper. Victory had come, not with triumph, but with weight. A strange kind of stillness followed her now, one that did not feel like freedom, but like inheritance. She had killed him, or had she? The rule of two demanded it. One to embody power, the other to crave it. And Zannah had craved it, shaped it, and now she wore it like armor. But something in her fingers trembled, not from weakness, not from fear, from memory. She could still feel Bane's presence, not in the force around her, but somewhere closer. Inside, whispers that sounded like her own voice, doubts that echoed with his tone. Was this the price of victory, or the proof she had not truly won? Kneeling at the heart of her sanctum, surrounded by tomes that reeked of forgotten power, Zannah opened her mind to the currents of the dark side. The energy no longer fought her. It bowed, but submission was not the same as peace. Her thoughts wandered to the moment his essence tried to take her, fused minds, tangled memories, wills pressed against each other, like twin storms. She had screamed, not aloud, but inside, and she had pushed back, harder than she ever had in her life. she had won, but had something stayed behind. She chose a new apprentice. Not strong, not yet, but angry, and that was enough. Anger could be shaped, pain could be guided. The boy didn't even know he was being molded. That was her first test, not of him, but of herself. Could she teach, not as Bane taught her, but as something new? The Sith did not allow softness, but she was not Bane, not entirely. She didn't want to be. She watched the boy in training, silent behind the shadows. He reminded her of herself before Ambria, before everything broke and was rebuilt in hate. He didn't look at her like a master. He looked at her like a storm about to strike. And maybe that was right, because she didn't yet know what she had become. Was she the storm, or was she the silence that came after? The galaxy continued to burn. Jedi hunted remnants of darkness, never knowing that the real Sith still breathed, hidden in plain sight. Zannah wore robes that didn't carry Bane's weight. Her voice never echoed like his, but she was darker in a way he never was, quieter, more careful. She didn't want to dominate. She wanted to endure. And in that silence, something stirred, a thought, unspoken, barely formed. What if she was more than his heir? What if she was the first to break the pattern, to wear the rule of two, but not be ruled by it? Could a Sith find her own way without becoming the monster she was trained by? The boy failed his first trial. She did not strike him down. She sent him back into the tombs of the old world, told him to return only when he brought something lost, something only fear could uncover. Bane would have killed him, but Zannah waited. That night, in the quiet of her chamber, she whispered to the shadows. She asked no one in particular, "Was I wrong?" The shadows didn't answer, but neither did they mock her. And in that, maybe, was the beginning of something different. Zannah moved through the galaxy with quiet confidence, now no longer in Bane's shadow, no longer weighed down by the question of worth. The rule of two was hers to carry forward, and she did so without hesitation. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just power, it was the shape of her thoughts, the way she saw others, the way she saw herself. She didn't choose her new apprentice right away. It wasn't about strength, it was about potential, about silence, about those who hid their ambition beneath layers of fear. She found Set Hearth, a former Jedi who had walked away from the Order without turning back. He wasn't angry, he wasn't lost. He was something more dangerous. Content, but beneath that surface, she saw it. The hunger, the questions, the edge that might one day be sharpened into something lethal. Zannah didn't force him into the Sith path. She offered him a choice. And when he agreed, it wasn't out of fear, it was out of curiosity. That scared her more than anything. Because curiosity could grow wild. It had no shape, no leash. She trained him, yes, but never like Bane had trained her. Her methods were quieter. She didn't shout, she didn't break bones or crush wills. She taught by letting him walk toward darkness on his own. Every lesson was a mirror, every exercise a test of restraint. She showed him how to wait, how to smile while thinking of murder, how to hide power so deeply that even Jedi wouldn't sense it. But sometimes, when the stars were still and the ship's engines silent, Zannah would sit alone and wonder, was she creating a Sith or something else? Was she honoring Bane's legacy or rewriting it? And more haunting still, was Bane truly gone? She had won their final battle. Her body had survived. Her mind was her own. But now and then when she meditated, she would feel a pulse, a flicker, a thought that didn't sound like hers. Sometimes it spoke in riddles, sometimes it laughed, and once it wept. Could it be that Bane had left a piece of himself inside her, a shadow that didn't die with his body, but shifted, waiting, watching, or was that just guilt? The echo of a voice she once feared so deeply it had carved itself into her mind. She never told Set. She didn't need to, but she noticed how often he looked at her, not with reverence but calculation. He was watching, learning, waiting, maybe just like she once had. The rule of two demanded it. And so the days passed. Systems fell. Jedi vanished. The Sith, though quiet, were never idle. And Zannah remained at the center. Not loud, not known, but present. Always present, watching the galaxy forget them again, knowing that forgetting was the first step toward their return. But beneath all of it, beneath the legacy, the ritual, the silence, there was something else. Something she never admitted, not even to herself. She missed him. Not the cruelty, not the pressure, but the clarity. Bane had given her purpose, a path, and without him, the stars felt colder, the silence longer, the throne lonelier. Was this what it meant to rule? The title of Dark Lord had never felt like a crown. It felt more like a wound, deep, constant, and hidden beneath layers of strength. Zannah carried it without complaint, but not without weight. Every choice she made was a step on a path only she could see, and she never stopped wondering if that path had been carved by her own will or if it was still shaped by his. Set Hearth grew bolder, stronger, but also distant. He questioned things she had once obeyed. He toyed with rules, with loyalties, with her, and Zannah, for all her coldness, felt a strange kind of ache. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even betrayal, it was recognition, the same look Bane once gave her, half warning, half dare, now stared back at her through Set's eyes. Was this how it always ended? Master teaches apprentice. Apprentice learns too well. And then silence. Zannah wondered if she would feel it coming, if the Force would whisper before the knife struck, or if it would happen the same way she had done it, fast, final, without ceremony. Still, she didn't stop him. She didn't tighten her grip. Instead, she taught him more, fed his hunger, gave him tools she knew he might someday use against her, because that was the truth behind the rule of two, not control, but surrender. A quiet agreement between predator and prey, blurred by time. And yet she hoped. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would choose differently, that he would see beyond the pattern, that he would evolve, that the Sith could become more than shadows repeating themselves. But the galaxy wasn't built on hope, not for people like her. So she waited, eyes open, heart steady. Every word she spoke to Set carried two meanings. Every lesson hid a trap. Every moment was a question, is this the one where it begins? And in the silence that followed each day, she would return to her solitude. She would meditate, she would breathe, and sometimes when the stars were quiet enough, she would hear his voice again. Not in words, not clearly, but in feeling, a cold wind that brushed the edges of her mind, a pressure that never left, a memory, maybe, or something more. Was she still herself? Or had Bane truly found a way to live on? And if he had, would she ever be free? The Sith legacy continued. It always would. But Zannah was more than just a name in a dark line. She was the blade and the wound, the student and the shadow, the survivor and perhaps the prison. And somewhere, In the deep silence of the Force, the future waited. Quiet, watching, and listening. She did not need statues. She did not want monuments. Power to Zannah was not about being seen. It was about being remembered by those who never even knew her name. As the years passed, she walked through the galaxy like a shadow without form. Never a throne, never a flag, just decisions, just movements. Whispers passed in low rooms, disappearances that were never investigated, fear that had no clear source. Even in the coldest parts of the Outer Rim, someone would always flinch at the mention of a certain death, and that was Zannah's design. Her enemies never quite saw her coming, because by the time they did, they were already part of her story. A story that was never written down, never celebrated, only felt. She didn't chase power through domination. She guided it through silence. While others shouted their intent across battlefields and Senate halls, Zannah watched. She waited. She made choices not for glory, but for alignment, aligning events, people, and outcomes like pieces on a board where no one realized they were being moved. Her apprentice never truly saw it. Not at first. He thought he was learning the rule of two, but he didn't see the way Zannah altered its rhythm. She didn't simply teach him to be stronger than her. She taught him to become invisible, to leave no evidence except change. And when that apprentice became Plagueis, something had already shifted in the current. Could it be that she had already begun reshaping the Sith from the inside out, quietly, without needing permission or credit? Maybe that was the real test. Bane never understood that the loudest darkness burns fast, but the quiet kind survives everything. There were no more duels, no more grand rituals, only time, years stacked atop years, during which the galaxy moved forward unaware. New wars began, new tyrants rose, but behind it all, behind the systems that failed and the rulers who fell, there was always some small thread leading back to her. A deal made in secret, a senator pushed to vote differently, a holocron misplaced, and found again in a future that she had already planned. What if this was always her design? That one day someone like Sidious would appear, someone whose cruelty wore the smile of a politician, whose genius did not come from one teacher, but from a buried legacy passed down in silence. Not a torch handed over, but a shadow stretched long enough to touch everything. And if that's true, if Zannah's power was not in what she did, but in what she allowed others to believe they did, then maybe she was the most successful Sith of all. Some say the Sith were reborn through violence, through blades drawn in firelight, and voices raised in betrayal. But what if their rebirth came through quiet correction? What if Zannah didn't rebuild the Sith Order with a scream, but with a whisper? She watched the mistakes of those who came before, the chaos, the waste, the endless hunger for credit, and she stripped all of that away. She left no signature, no trace, just influence. She didn't crave the fear that came from being known. She craved the fear that came from not knowing where it came from. Plagueis never asked where some of his ideas came from. He believed they were his own. That was the beauty of her method. By the time an idea reached the lips of the next Sith, it already felt ancient, as though the Force itself had whispered it in his dreams. But maybe it wasn't the Force. Maybe it was her. There are records, broken, scattered, that speak of Plagueis as the beginning of a new kind of Sith, focused not just on killing, but on understanding life. But that shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a seed planted long before. Zannah had spent years with Sith magic. She knew how to bend thoughts. She knew how to shape the spirit without breaking the body. And she passed that down, not directly, but subtly. Could it be that Plagueis' obsession with midichlorians, with preserving life, with cheating death, wasn't just a breakthrough? Could it have been a continuation of her vision? Not immortality through domination, but immortality through influence, through memory, through systems that do not carry names but carry goals. She never returned to the Sith temples. She didn't need to. Her temple was time. Her archive was the actions of those who never even knew she existed. And as she aged, something strange began to happen. She started to disappear, not just from the galaxy, but from the stories. Historians forgot her. Sith records grew thin. Even holocrons that once bore her presence became difficult to activate, as though she was pulling herself out of the narrative on purpose. But why? Was it shame, regret, or was it strategy? Maybe she knew that the strongest power is the one that can vanish and still remain in control. There were whispers, not loud ones, not in places where Jedi might hear, but in backwater trading stations and in deep, dark ruins where Force-sensitive scavengers sometimes heard voices. The whispers spoke of a woman, not a name, just a presence, one who never died, one who simply moved, who watched, who corrected. They said she had no face, that if you saw her, you'd forget her. But something in your mind would change. You'd become careful, paranoid. You'd question your loyalties, and slowly you'd begin to follow a path you never meant to. Not because you were forced, because it felt right, because it felt like it was yours. But was it? What if Zannah never needed to rule with lightning? What if she became the lightning? Not in the sky, but in the blood, passed from one apprentice to the next, not through commands, but through instinct. What if she embedded her will into the very structure of the rule of two, so that even generations later, when Sith Lords claimed new ideas as their own, they were still acting under her design? Some believe Sidious was the ultimate Sith, that he mastered deception, patience, and the long game. But even Sidious followed rules he didn't invent. He built on foundations that were already there. Rules about secrecy, manipulation, trust, twisted into fear. Could it be that these weren't just the nature of the dark side, but the legacy of one woman's quiet hands? Zannah never returned to make claims, never stood on a battlefield to prove herself. She didn't need to. Her victory was not in one moment. It was in every Sith who ever thought they were free, but acted like her. Every Sith who looked in the mirror and never knew they were wearing her mask. And in the end, when all other names are forgotten and only shadows remain, maybe that's when she finally wins, when no one remembers her, but everyone still obeys. When people speak of the Sith, they speak of violence, of red sabers drawn in the dark, of explosions echoing across ruined cities. They remember names like Palpatine, Vader, Maul, names that struck fear into entire systems. But long before those names rose and fell, there was Zannah. And unlike the others, Zannah was not remembered for fire or thunder. She was remembered for silence. She had no throne, no empire, no armies marching under her banner. What she had was patience and knowledge. The kind of knowledge that doesn't roar. It waits. It coils itself into shadows. It whispers through bloodlines. And over time, it changes everything. Zannah never wanted to rule the galaxy with brute strength. That was Bane's way. But Bane was born in a time of open war, when Sith was slaughtered by the hundreds and only raw power could keep you alive. Zannah grew up in a different world, one where fear was a better weapon than a blade, where survival meant knowing when not to be seen. And maybe that is why her understanding of the rule of two was so quiet. She did not challenge the rule. She didn't rewrite it. But what if she changed it in ways that no one noticed, at least not at first? The rule of two was meant to be a cycle. One master, one apprentice. The stronger would rise, the weaker would fall. But what happens when both stop playing the game the same way? What happens when the apprentice wins, but chooses not to destroy what came before? Zannah was clever, maybe too clever. She didn't just defeat Bane. She absorbed him, or tried to. No one really knows. Some say she destroyed him. Others say he lived on, buried deep inside her, like a shadow she could never fully cast out. If that's true, if even a piece of Bane remained, then the line between master and apprentice blurred forever. And maybe that was the start of something dangerous. Because after Zannah, everything changed. No Sith after her truly followed the rule of two in its purest form. Plagueis took Sidious, but kept him hidden far too long. Sidious trained Maul, Dooku, even Anakin, all while still alive. The rule had shifted, twisted. It became less about balance and more about control. Could it be that Zannah was the first to bend the rule without breaking it? That by surviving Bane not just in victory, but by possibly carrying him within, she set a new path. One that led to the Sith's greatest rise and eventual fall. But even if she did change the rule, was that wrong? She ensured the Sith survived. She planted seeds so deep they grew in silence, untouched for generations. She didn't crave attention. She didn't need a legacy. In fact, that's what made her so dangerous. She didn't care if history forgot her, because she knew the Sith would remember, quietly, privately, in the dark. She took on an apprentice, trained him, passed on her knowledge, but she did not demand that he be like her. That was the secret. Zannah didn't create followers. She created thinkers, Sith who questioned, who wondered, who dreamed not of destruction, but of what came after. And yet, that too was a risk. Because questioning leads to doubt, and doubt to weakness. Could it be that Zannah's legacy wasn't just about survival, but about decay? Maybe she gave the Sith too much freedom, too much room to evolve until they forgot what they were meant to be, until they became manipulators in politics, not warriors of truth, until they lost the edge that made them terrifying, until they became fragile. Was that her mistake, or was it her genius? The galaxy will never know, because by the time the Sith rose again under Sidious, Zannah's name had already been lost, erased, not by enemies, but by design. She had vanished so completely that only faint traces remained, in ancient holocrons, in footnotes of forgotten texts, in dreams whispered by those who sensed something old. But maybe that was her plan all along. Zannah never wanted to be worshipped. She wanted to be obeyed, not through fear of her presence, but fear of her absence, because in her absence the Sith became reckless, loud, hungry for power that could be seen. They stopped listening for silence. They forgot how powerful it could be. There's an old Sith belief that power reveals itself not in the strike of a saber, but in the pause before it, in the quiet where hesitation dies. Zannah lived in that pause. She trained herself not to rush, not to burn too fast. She could wait years for the right moment, decades even. That's what made her different. Maybe what made her dangerous. And maybe what made her a curse. Because power like that is hard to teach, harder still to pass on. Her apprentice, whoever he truly was in the end, did not become Zannah. He became something else. Maybe more violent, maybe less patient, maybe eager to leave a mark. But that's the trap, isn't it? Wanting to be remembered. Zannah never needed remembrance. She needed results, and she got them. The Sith survived her, passed through her, grew stronger in the dark, like roots under ice. But strength that hides too well eventually forgets what it's hiding from. The Sith became shadows behind thrones, hands behind curtains, masters of politics, not predators of chaos. And when the time came to show themselves again, they were powerful but exposed. Sidious ruled the galaxy, but he ruled from a seat that anyone could strike, and eventually someone did. Was that Zannah Sip's legacy too? Did she build a path that led to triumph and made it fragile? Or was the fall of the Sith never about the rule of two at all? Maybe it was about forgetting how to feel. Zannah felt everything: the loss of her childhood, the weight of killing her master, the silence that followed. She didn't drown it out. She lived in it, let it shape her. Her emotions weren't obstacles, they were weapons. But later Sith, they buried their feelings, hid behind masks, thought rage was enough. Zannah knew better. And still, even she might have wondered, late at night, when there were no apprentices to train, no threats to silence. Did she ever wonder if she had done the right thing? Did she miss Bane's voice, even if only the echo of it? Or did she carry it always? Some say she laughed in her final days, that she died alone but at peace, that she whispered something no one could understand. Others say she was betrayed by her own apprentice, just as the rule demanded, but no one can agree on what truly happened. Because there sends no record, no tomb, no trace. Only the fact that the Sith continued. And maybe that was the only proof she ever needed. Some stories are told with fire, others with blood. But Zannah's story was told with silence, not the kind that hides fear, the kind that waits, the kind that waits, the kind that waits, the kind that outlasts. She never stood on palace balconies or gave speeches. She didn't leave monuments or temples. What she left behind was harder to see and even harder to remove. A pattern, a discipline, a set of choices that shaped the future long after her name faded. And that might be the strangest part. How does someone disappear so completely and still win? Because if the rule of two truly worked, if it carried the Sith all the way to Sidious, to Vader, to the fall of the Jedi, then doesn't Zannah deserve more credit than anyone? But then, if that same rule led to their collapse, if arrogance and greed poisoned the line, was that her fault too? Could she have changed it, or was she bound to follow the rule exactly as Bane had designed it? Some believe she twisted it, quietly, made it hers, that she taught patience where Bane had taught pressure, that she valued survival more than dominance. Maybe she saw the future coming and chose to bend, not break. And yet, bending can become surrender. Maybe her silence gave space for decay. Maybe her apprentices learned to hide too well. Maybe they stopped challenging each other and started protecting themselves. Was that the real curse? Or was it something else? Something deeper, more human? Maybe Zannah loved Bane. Not in a way that weakens, but in a way that confuses, that makes you hesitate, that lingers in your decisions like a shadow. Maybe she never truly let him go. And maybe he never let go of her. There are whispers, ancient Sith rumors, that when she died, there was a moment, a flicker, when her body didn't fall, that her eyes changed, just for a second, and in that second, it wasn't her. Could it be? Could Bane have survived inside her all along? Or was that the final lesson? That even in death, the master teaches and the apprentice obeys. Zannah Sip's legacy isn't Sipped a statue, is Sip's a question. And the galaxy is still trying to answer it. The galaxy spun onward. Stars were born, wars were fought, peace returned, only to be broken again. But through all of it, there was a quiet presence. She didn't speak to the galaxy, didn't leave monuments, didn't write herself into the pages of history. Yet she was there, watching, waiting. Zannah had become something else. Not a warlord, not a ruler, not even a shadow cast by her master. She became the quiet itself. After her final confrontation with Darth Bane, the world expected something loud, something that shook the stars. But it didn't come. There was no declaration, no empire raised in her name. Instead, she stepped deeper into the dark, letting the story of her survival fade into rumor. People who once whispered about her began to forget. Even among Sith circles, her name softened into myth. Perhaps that was her plan. Perhaps forgetting her was the first step in giving her true power. She moved between ruined temples, forgotten worlds, ancient sites of Sith memory, not to claim them, but to learn from them. She read carvings no one else could understand, listened to echoes buried in the Force. She wasn't looking for power in the way most Sith did. She wasn't building armies or crafting weapons. She was trying to understand something else, something Bane never taught her. Patience, stillness, the power of doing nothing until the moment was right. And maybe that's what made her dangerous. Because most Sith wanted control now. They acted with noise, with fire. Zannah watched them burn themselves out. She saw future enemies before they knew they were enemies. She predicted betrayals before the blade was ever drawn. She didn't strike first. She didn't have to. They always came to her. And when they did, they never left. There was one apprentice she took. Quietly, without ceremony. A boy who had no name when she found him, just scars and anger. She didn't raise him with kindness, but she didn't lie to him either. She gave him truth, sharp, cold truth. She taught him that the galaxy was asleep, that the Jedi had lulled it into dreaming, and that their job was not to wake it up, but to watch over it until the time came to change everything. This boy would later be known to few as Darth Cognus, and even fewer would understand the kind of master he had. To him, Zannah was not a conqueror or tyrant. She was a whisper behind his thoughts, a question that never left him. She taught with silence, corrected with a glance. She rarely showed anger, but when she did, the Force itself seemed to tense around her. But was she still Zannah, or had something else taken hold of her? That question never left Cognus. There were moments, rare, terrifying moments, when her voice would shift, her eyes would lose focus, as if another presence stirred inside her. A presence colder, heavier, as if Darth Bane still lived somewhere deep within. Was he truly gone, or had she caged him, buried but not dead? No one could answer that, not even her. She would sometimes stand alone in the dark, staring at nothing for hours, as if listening for something only she could hear. Some believed she was meditating. Others wondered if she was arguing with the voice of her master, still fighting that last duel long after it ended. Years passed, then decades. Zannah left no trace. She stayed just far enough from every major event. She watched the Clone Wars begin, centuries before they ever had a name. She sensed the slow decay of the Jedi, the way their light flickered even as they held to hope. She watched from the cracks of forgotten worlds, beneath the roots of lifeless forests. She didn't interfere. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. Because she knew something the others didn't start. She knew that real power wasn't in taking the galaxy, it was in shaping the one who would. Darth Cognos never felt like he truly knew her. Even after years at her side, her silence held weight he could never understand. She did not demand loyalty. She did not ask for praise. She expected understanding without needing to explain. And when she did speak, it felt like the galaxy itself leaned in to listen. She taught him to feel the Force not just in motion, but in stillness, to notice where fear hides in peace, where hatred coils behind a smile, where power waits in the pause before a decision. Her lessons were not written down, they were learned through presence, through watching her navigate the quiet edges of conflict, where control was invisible but absolute. And yet, he also feared her. Because every now and then, when the air was still and the stars above seemed to hold their breath, she would whisper things that didn't sound like her voice. Things that felt older, heavier, shaped by another will. Cognos never dared ask if Bane still lingered within her, but he wondered, often, was she haunted, or was she hosting something? Zannah never answered, not directly. But once when they stood at the edge of a dead planet, staring into a collapsed temple, she said something that never left him. Some voices don't set fade, they wait. He thought it was a warning. He later understood it was a truth she lived with. The galaxy went on, sleeping. The Sith remained too. No one saw them. No one hunted them. They had become myth again, and that was exactly what Zannah wanted. In myth, there is freedom. In silence, there is space to shape futures. Cognos learned to mirror her patience, but deep down he was not her. He was always drawn to movement, to eventual conquest, and she knew that she never stopped him from wanting more, only taught him to delay the hunger until it became clarity. And then, as all Sith masters must, Zannah disappeared. There was no death, no battle, no final duel witnessed by stars. She simply stopped returning to their meeting place. Cognos searched for her, desperate, afraid, then angry, but she left no trail. Not even the Force gave him answers. It was as if she had stepped behind the veil of the galaxy itself. Some say she died. Others believe she became something else, not a ghost, not a memory, but a ripple. A constant tension in the current of the dark side. There are moments when future Sith, even Sidious himself, reported feeling watched when they thought they were alone. A shadow behind the throne. A whisper beneath ambition. Could it be that Zannah never truly left? Could it be that her silence shaped the Sith more than any scream of battle ever could? Because it was Zannah who kept the rule of two alive, not through dominance but through discipline. She understood what Bane did not, that fear is loud, but control is quiet. That power screams in its early days, but matures into stillness. Her legacy is not in wars fought or temples built. It is in the apprentices who thought they were free, only to realize they had always been following her path. And maybe that was her design all along. Years later, long after Darth Cognos took her own apprentice and vanished into history, a new Sith would rise. His name was Darth Plagueis. He believed in secrets, in experiments, in shaping destiny from the shadows. He did not seek thrones. He sought understanding, control without exposure, influence without name. And though he never spoke it aloud, though no record ties his philosophy to her, there is a question that lingers. Was Plagueis walking a path Zannah carved? Could it be that her silence taught him how to move? Because what Zannah left behind was not a doctrine. It was a feeling that power must be hidden to be safe, that noise brings weakness, that the greatest empires begin in the mind, not the battlefield. Plagueis trained Sidious. Sidious built an empire, but it was Zannah who taught silence, and it was silence that Sidious mastered before he mastered death. He wore masks for decades, played a role in public, hid his power behind layers of fiction, and when he struck, it was with the precision of someone who had watched everything, waited for the exact moment, and left no trace until it was too late. Is it really so far-fetched to think that her influence echoed there? Maybe not in name, maybe not even in memory, but in method. Zannah never asked to be remembered. She didn't need temples or monuments. She didn't write her name into the stars. She wrote it into the silence between them, into the quiet moments where decisions shaped the galaxy without a single weapon drawn. There is something haunting about that, something beautiful too. A girl taken in a war, trained by a monster, changed by fear, hardened by loss, twisted by pain, and then transformed by something darker than hate, something colder than rage. Purpose. And yet, maybe it wasn't purpose alone that defined her. Maybe she was the only Sith who truly understood what it meant to serve the rule of two, not as a way to rule, but as a way to last. Because war burns out, but a whisper can echo forever. If Palpatine's rise was the thunder, then Zannah was the storm cloud that gathered long before. If the Clone Wars were fire, then Zannah was the cold that made fire necessary. She never shouted. She never stood on stages. She never gave speeches or waved flags. She just watched and guided and disappeared. And in doing so, she may have shaped more than any Sith who came before her. Was it all planned, or did she become what the Sith needed without even knowing it? Could it be that she was both the preserver and the destroyer? Maybe the galaxy will never know. Maybe its skies not meant to. But in every shadow where the Sith once stood, in every moment when fear won without a fight, in every apprentice who watched while others moved too soon, there is a trace of her. Not loud, not proud, just present, watching, still. The dust on Malachor had never settled. It drifted like memory, shifting with each whisper of wind that moved through the dead planet's fractured stone. Long ago, war had torn this place apart. Jedi and Sith locked in a clash that ended in silence. Now only shadows walked here. Shadows, and one man who had come searching for something he couldn't name. His name had been lost to time. Or perhaps he had simply stopped using it. He had no master, no order, no purpose, not anymore. The Force had led him here. Or maybe it wasn't the Force at all. Maybe it was something older, colder, something watching. He had wandered the surface for days, following broken carvings etched into obsidian walls, listening to voices that didn't speak in words. At first, he thought it was madness. The dark side often played tricks, but this felt different. This felt like someone remembering him. Inside the ruins, deeper than he had dared to go before, he found it, a chamber shaped like a star, long sealed beneath the weight of centuries. The air tasted still. No life had entered here since before the Clone Wars. And yet, the moment he stepped inside, he felt it, not fear, not even danger. Something softer, quieter, like being watched by something that didn't want him dead, just understood. He sat on the floor. He didn't know why. He simply couldn't move. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from something ancient brushing against his soul, not touching, just close enough to remind him that he was not alone. And then he heard the name. Zannah. It came not as a sound, but as a memory, not his own. A thought placed gently into his mind. It didn't demand. It didn't shout, it waited, as if asking him whether he was ready to know more. Who was she? He had heard the name once, whispered in a forgotten Sith scroll. The apprentice of Darth Bane. The heir who vanished. No tomb, no holocron, no legends, just silence, as if history had agreed not to speak her name. But why now? Why him? He reached into the Force, deeper than ever before, past anger, past fear, past even ambition, and there in the stillness he felt something brush back. Not power, not temptation, but presence, not a voice, not a shape, just a waiting mind, cold, patient, a mind that had seen centuries fall like dust, a mind that did not want to be remembered, only obeyed. The acolyte closed his eyes, and in the blackness behind them he saw her, not clearly, not in form, but in feeling, in pain, in silence. A Sith who had never needed an empire, a master who had never asked for worship, a whisper who had lived through others, bending fate without showing her hand. Could it be that she had never truly died? Could Zannah have found a way to exist beyond the body, not like the Jedi who became ghosts, but something else, something hidden, something rooted in the fear of those who use the dark side without understanding it? He breathed slowly, his palms flat on the stone. He could feel her beneath it, not as bones, as memory, as echo, watching him, waiting. The rule of two had always been about power, but Zannah, she had never ruled the way others did. She did not gather armies or demand loyalty. She simply planted seeds, let them grow, and when the time was right, she vanished, leaving the garden to feed itself. Was that the plan all along? He opened his eyes. The chamber was still. The silence had returned, but now it wasn't empty. It was listening. The silence didn't leave him, not even when he climbed out of the chamber, not even when the cold winds of Malachor scraped at his skin. It followed him, not as a burden, but as a thread he couldn't cut. He no longer heard voices, no visions, but he felt her, a pressure behind thought, a shape beneath his thoughts that was not his. At night, he stopped lighting fires. He no longer needed warmth. The cold was a teacher now, a constant whisper that reminded him he was part of something he could not name. The stars above didn't guide him anymore. His path came from below. He stopped calling himself Sith. That word felt small now. What he had touched, what had touched him, was older than titles, older than even Bane's hunger. It was patience, a kind of clarity only the forgotten understand. Each night he sat alone, letting the wind pull at his robe, letting time slip past without measure. He didn't meditate, he didn't reach for power. He simply listened, and every so often something in the stillness would nod back, not with words, just presence, just awareness, like a hand pressed lightly against the back of his mind. Was this Zannah, or something she had left behind? He began writing, not scrolls or holocrons, just marks, symbols carved into broken walls and fallen stones. He didn't understand them. They came from dreams, shapes that echoed feelings, not meaning. But each time he drew one, he felt a strange release, like removing a thought that didn't belong to him, like copying a memory before it vanished. And sometimes, after drawing, he would cry. Not loudly, not in pain, just small tears falling down his face without reason. He didn't know whose sadness it was, his own or hers. Could a whisper carry grief? Could a legacy feel lonely? He thought of the Jedi, how they spoke of becoming one with the Force, of letting go. But this wasn't letting go. This was holding on in silence, not to control, not to return, but to keep something alive, quietly, secretly, patiently. One night he asked aloud, "Why me?" The wind didn't answer. The ground gave no sign, but in his chest something stirred, a warmth that didn't come from outside, a knowing. Maybe he wasn't chosen. Maybe he was just the one who stopped shouting long enough to listen. Was that all Zannah ever needed? Not a warrior, not a conqueror, just someone willing to hear what the galaxy had forgotten. The next morning, he found a new ruin, one he had passed many times without noticing. It wasn't grand. It had no statues, just a stone circle buried beneath vines and dust. But when he stepped inside, the air shifted. He sat, and for a moment he felt nothing. No voice, no presence. Then he smiled. She was already here. He stayed in the stone circle for days. No food, no water. Time faded into the rhythm of breath and wind. And in that stillness, memories not his own began to stir. He saw flashes of her life, not as visions, but as sensations, the weight of decision, the ache of silence, the burden of being right when no one could ever know. There was no pride, no need to be remembered, only the quiet satisfaction of a plan set in motion and a choice to never be thanked for it. In one moment, he felt her standing over her apprentice, knowing the boy would one day try to kill her, and knowing she would let him try, not because she wanted to die, but because the rule demanded it, even if it broke her. Was that strength, or something deeper? He stood in the center of the circle and spoke her name, not loudly, just enough for the stones to hear, and somehow he knew they already had. Around the ruins, the air thickened. Not dark, not bright, just full, like a room that had been waiting to be noticed. His heart beat slower, his thoughts drifted softer, and something inside him shifted. He wasn't alone, but it was instead her. Not really, not fully. It was a pattern, a presence that lived in the cracks between time, not watching, not guiding, but anchoring, as if she had left a piece of her mind hidden in the stone, not to speak, but to survive. How many others had passed here without seeing it? How many had been too loud, too quick, too certain? He wondered if the Sith had misunderstood her, if they thought her quiet life was weakness, if they mistook survival for fear. But maybe Zannah had known the truth all along, that empires crumble, names fade, and power always eats itself. Only ideas survive, and hers had never stopped. The next morning he placed his hand on the oldest stone and closed his eyes. Not to reach out, not to take, just to listen. What he felt wasn't power in the way the Sith taught. It wasn't hunger or domination. It was something older, something gentler, not soft, but still, like water that refuses to move unless you disturb it. And when he disturbed it, just a little, it responded. It didn't speak words. It gave him memories of silence. A corridor, dim and cold. A breath held too long. The feeling of standing behind someone and choosing not to strike, letting them walk away because their time hadn't come yet. The understanding that true control meant not needing to act. He wept, not from sadness, from recognition. He had always thought the rule of two was about conflict, about killing your master, about proving strength through violence. But what if that was only part of it? What if Zannah had followed the rule so completely that she removed herself from history on purpose? What if she had succeeded where all others failed by becoming invisible? He walked beyond the circle. The ground there was untouched, but something still pulled him, like a thread wrapped around the ribs of the world, buried deep but always connected. He remembered the old Sith texts that spoke of ghosts trapped in armor, of voices clinging to holocrons. But Zannah had no holocron, no statue, no tomb, just whispers and dust. And yet, here he was, feeling her, learning from her. He wondered, had she always wanted it this way? To plant the future in soil no one would ever till, to die forgotten, so her path could grow without eyes watching. Maybe she believed power was safer when no one knew where it lived. When the sun finally fell and the stars returned, he stayed sitting among the rocks, not meditating, not searching, just breathing, the same way she must have, once, long ago. He thought of how the galaxy had changed, republics risen and fallen, wars, emperors, Jedi, all of them crashing into each other like waves against stone. But this place had stayed quiet. It had never needed armies. It didn't crave monuments. It simply waited. And that waiting, that silence, was its power. He tried to imagine her face, though he'd never seen it. Tried to imagine her eyes watching the galaxy sleep, generation after generation, never interfering unless the pattern broke. Maybe she passed teachings to her apprentice through riddles, not commands. Maybe she made him earn every secret. And maybe when the time came to fall, she didn't fight it. She vanished like a shadow turning with the sun. And in that disappearance, the rule of two became more than survival. It became belief. A way of seeing the galaxy not as a battlefield, but as a tide to be studied, manipulated, shifted, one grain of sand at a time. She didn't want praise. She wanted the Sith to survive. He stood and faced the wind. It touched his cheek like something that knew him, something old, something proud, not of what he would build, but of what he now understood. Zannah had not failed. She had not vanished. She had become the silence itself. A whisper that could only be heard by those who listened without fear. And he had listened. He turned to leave, but not empty, not lost. He carried her now, not in memory, but in method. And as he disappeared into the dark, something beneath the dust finally rested. The galaxy had moved on. Names like Zannah were no longer spoken, not in temples, not in council halls, not even among Sith cults that lingered like fading smoke. But what if that was her intention all along? While the Jedi chased wars and governments rose and fell, something deeper was being shaped, not in the light of history, but in its shadows. Zannah didn't vanish because she failed. She vanished because she had already done enough. Her strength wasn't in planets ruled or armies built. It was in patience, in planning, in knowing that the Sith couldn't survive in open view. Not yet. The galaxy wasn't ready to accept them again, not through battle but through silence. On ancient worlds, strange alignments began to emerge. Dark temples, untouched for centuries, would show signs of quiet life. Not people, but echoes. Broken stones warmed in places where the cold had ruled for millennia. Holocrons, long thought dead, flickered to life, for moments whispering names that had never been recorded in any archive. Some claimed to hear footsteps behind them in ruins too broken to hold life. Who was leaving these marks? Some believed the Force was balancing itself. Others thought the Jedi had missed something in their teachings. But there is one theory that has never truly gone away, that Zannah never left the galaxy. Not entirely. That she planted threads, not of control, but of influence. A plan too slow for most Sith to understand. A path that didn't lead to dominance, but to survival. Could she have seen what Bane never did? That strength alone was not enough. That to truly outlast the Jedi, the Sith had to become quieter than silence itself. She had watched the world through fear once, as a child hiding from war, as an apprentice learning that pain was power. But now, if the stories are true, she had watched it through something colder, something more deliberate. She had watched the Jedi rebuild. She had seen the Republic grow soft, and she had let it happen. But not without preparation. One lost holocron, reportedly found beneath the ashes of Zeost, carried a voice that did not name itself. But it spoke of waiting. It spoke of sacrifice, not for power, but for timing. It told the listener that the rule of two was not about victory in battle. It was about being the last voice when all others had gone silent. Some believe that holocron belonged to Zannah. Others believe it was bait, placed there by someone who wanted the legend to spread. Either way, it worked. Centuries later, Sidious would rise with knowledge far too precise to have been gathered in one lifetime. Some of that knowledge, the placement of Jedi vaults, the location of hyperspace beacons, the names of long-forgotten enemies, those details were never taught by Plagueis alone. Could it be that Zannah left maps not just of places but of people? The Sith had always craved power, domination, conquest. But Zannah seemed to crave something else. She didn't rise with fire. She didn't die with ceremony. She faded on purpose. But if that was the end of her, why does her name keep returning in fragments of forgotten lore? Somewhere on Moraband, buried deep within a cracked and unlit temple, a Force-sensitive historian once claimed to have touched something ancient, not an object. A presence. It felt like a hand brushing past their mind, cold, patient, watching. They fled, but not before hearing a single whisper, "Not yet." That phrase haunts those who study Sith history. Not yet, not your time, not your war, not your purpose. Was this Zannah's voice, or something older? Or could it be that her voice had merged with something else, the Force itself? If Zannah had truly survived beyond the flesh, if she had bound pieces of herself to sites of pain and thought, her legacy wouldn't need statues or tombs. It would exist in silence and in waiting. A ghost without fear. A mind that knew her ideas were too dangerous to live, but too perfect to die. And if she had become something more, not immortal but scattered, what would her goal be? Perhaps she saw what others didn't, that the Sith weren't destroyed by strength, but by speed. Every time they rose too fast, they burned out. She had learned from Bane. She had learned from the Jedi. But most importantly, she had learned from herself. She had watched war. She had watched peace. And in both she saw patterns. The Jedi, for all their wisdom, always left gaps. Emotional gaps. Political ones. They never learned to predict the Sith because they never believed the Sith could be patient. Zannah changed that. By not making herself known, by not drawing the Jedi's gaze, she stretched the rule of two across centuries, not through might, through whispers. What if she passed more than one apprentice? What if she allowed some to fail, on purpose, just to test the galaxy's reaction? What if her greatest skill was not in training, but in filtering, making sure only the most invisible survived? Could she have known that one day the galaxy would be blind to the Sith once again? The way Sidious moved, the way he grew in secret, it felt familiar, not just to Bane's teachings, but to something subtler, a method, A rhythm, the slow accumulation of trust, the manipulation of systems, the avoidance of brute force until the final moment. These weren't just Sith traits, they were Zannah's. And here's the question that many fear to ask. Was Sidious truly the final product of the Sith, or was he simply one more step in Zannah's long, silent design? The Jedi thought they had defeated darkness many times. The Republic believed it had restored balance. But if Zannah had seen through all of it, if she had chosen disappearance not out of weakness but out of faith in her own ideas, then perhaps the galaxy never stopped being hers. Some say the Sith lost because of arrogance, that Sidious reached too far, that Vader broke the cycle. But what if that was part of the cycle? What if Zannah saw that the Sith could never win forever, and so she didn't try to win, she tried to survive? Survival meant silence. It meant letting time move without leaving fingerprints, and it meant letting others think they were in control. The Jedi, the Senate, the people, even her own apprentices, all of them walking forward, unaware they were part of something designed long before their birth. If that was Zannah's true plan, it would make her not just a Sith, but something different. A ghost architect, a shadow that didn't fight wars, but shaped the reasons for them. A presence that adjusted the galaxy's balance without ever being seen. And maybe she understood something the others didn't. That evil, if too loud, always burns out. That power, if too fast, always collapses. So she made her legacy quiet. She made it boring. She made it forgettable. That's why there are no grand stories of her rule, no great wars, no banners with her name, because she didn't need them. In fact, she avoided them. The more people forgot her, the safer her ideas became. Her thoughts lived on, not through monuments, but through imitation. And Sidious, he was an imitator, maybe not even knowingly, but his rise looked like hers, slowly gaining trust, twisting systems, making himself necessary, not feared. That wasn't just strategy, that was Zannah's signature. So, was she the one who cursed the Sith? Or did she give them the only path they could walk? There's something haunting about a legacy that chooses silence. Most Sith wanted to be remembered, to be feared. But Zannah, she wanted the opposite. She wanted time to erase her name, while her influence lived on. What kind of person does that? What kind of Sith chooses obscurity? Maybe one who knew the truth, that the Jedi were not as strong as they seemed, that the galaxy was built on myths, and that real power doesn't come from ruling, but from being the reason others think they're in control. Maybe she didn't trust the Sith anymore. Not fully. Maybe she saw in them what Bane feared, that pride would undo them, so she designed a slower poison. One that would seep into the galaxy, unseen, shaping generations. And still, the Force didn't stop her. That's the strange part. There were moments, tiny ones, where the Force could have corrected her path, where visions might have warned someone, where voices might have whispered, but they didn't. What if the Force allowed it? What if Zannah's silence was not a mistake, but a thread the Force itself needed to stay alive? It's a strange thought, that someone so quiet could echo louder than war, that a plan with no credit could change the future more than any blade. But that's the story she left behind, one we still don't fully understand. Years passed, and then centuries, and still no one spoke her name, not even the Sith who followed. Not even Sidious, whose empire would seem like the final perfect rise of the dark side. But maybe that's what Zannah wanted, for her ideas to live without her shadow blocking their light. Plagueis believed he had discovered something new, the manipulation of midichlorians, the search for immortality, the quiet influence over politics rather than brute force. But if we trace the roots, they don't begin with him. They begin in silence, in the era where Zannah vanished, where she stopped being a person and became a method. Did she teach her apprentice more than we know? Did she pass on secrets that weren't about lightning or rage, but about timing and hiding? Imagine Zannah whispering to her apprentice not how to destroy the Jedi, but how to make the Jedi destroy themselves. Not how to rule the Senate, but how to make the Senate desperate for control. It wasn't about fear, it was about decay, slow, inevitable, like rust on a locked door. And in this silence, the Sith didn't just survive, they adapted. They became part of the very systems meant to stop them. They wore masks, took new names, let others speak the loud words while they pulled quiet strings. That's not Bane's Sith. That's something colder, more patient. That's Zannah's shadow. Could it be that Sidious's empire, so loud, so brutal, was never the real success? Maybe the real achievement was that it happened at all, that it could rise so smoothly, under so many eyes, and only be seen when it was too late. That kind of deception doesn't come from warlords. It comes from thinkers, from ghosts. Zannah didn't need to be in the room. She needed the room to behave the way she designed, and it did. That's what makes her terrifying. She broke the idea that power must be visible. She showed that control doesn't need credit, and when you remove the ego from evil, it becomes harder to destroy. The Jedi weren't prepared for that. They were trained to fight battles, to see the Sith as warriors, not weavers, and so even when the signs were there, they missed them, because the Sith they expected had already vanished, replaced by something older, quieter, and far more dangerous. Could Zannah have known it would go this far? Could she have predicted Sidious, Vader, the collapse of the Republic? Or was that never her goal? Maybe she wasn't trying to build an empire. Maybe she was trying to protect an idea, one that could never be fully killed, only buried and reborn. And in doing so, maybe she accepted something the others refused to see, that the Sith could never truly win. But they could outlast. They could endure. Even if that meant no one would remember the one who made it all possible.